In 2018, a survey of roughly 150 business owners quietly produced one of the most useful data points in personal finance. Researchers tracked what these people actually spent each month across different levels of wealth, and what they found wasn't what anyone expected. As net worth climbed from $1 million to $10 million to $50 million, spending didn't keep climbing with it. It flattened. The number plateaued, and at a certain point, it barely moved at all. That finding sits in the back of your mind for a while, because if spending stops growing long before the wealth does, what does that say about the number you've been told you need? Here's the gap. Most people believe that real financial security, the kind where you stop worrying, requires somewhere north of $10 million. And that belief didn't come from nowhere. It came from headlines, from social media, from financial products designed to make you feel perpetually behind. But when you look at what people with serious money actually spend, the number that shows up is nowhere near what the internet would have you believe. So the question worth sitting with is this: what if the finish line is already within reach, and nobody told you? That's what this video is about. There's a disconnect between the retirement numbers being sold to you and the retirement numbers supported by real spending data. And that gap is quietly keeping millions of people at jobs they don't need, grinding toward a target that was never grounded in reality to begin with. My name is Alex, and if you've ever stared at your retirement account and wondered whether you'll ever actually get there, stay with me, because the math here is more forgiving than you've been led to believe. And I'm going to show you exactly how to calculate your real number and why it's almost certainly lower than you think. Once you understand how spending actually behaves as wealth grows, you'll stop chasing a moving target and start building towards something you can genuinely reach. The place to start is with the data itself and what those 150 business owners actually revealed about the relationship between wealth and spending. Stop and think about that for a second. 150 business owners tracked across every major wealth tier, and spending just stops climbing. That's not intuition. That's not philosophy. That's what the numbers actually showed. But before we get into the data, let's talk about what most people believe the number is, because the starting point matters. Pull up any financial forum right now, and you'll find the same answers cycling through: 10 million, 15 million. Some corners of the internet have pushed it to 25 million, with elaborate justifications about inflation, healthcare costs, and lifestyle creep. And look, none of those concerns are invented. They're real. But the number itself, the headline figure, has drifted so far from how wealthy people actually live that it's become more myth than math. Here's a concrete example of what that myth looks like in practice. There's a portfolio manager in Austin, Texas, manages other people's money for a living, so he thinks about this more carefully than most. Net worth is sitting at around $92 million as of last year. 3 properties, 2 kids in public school, flies commercial unless a client is paying. His household spends roughly $22,000 a month. When his own advisor suggested he could comfortably double that without touching the principal, he paused for a moment and said, "Double it on what exactly? Everything we want, we already have." That's not humility for the camera. That's what spending saturation actually looks like from the inside. And this is where it gets interesting, because that portfolio manager isn't unusual. He's representative. And the data from that survey of business owners tells the same story at scale. When net worth sits below $1 million, monthly spending averages somewhere around $9,000. When it crosses into the $1 to $10 million range, spending climbs, but only to about $15,000 a month. Then something unexpected happens. Even as net worth pushes into the $10 to $50 million range, monthly spending barely moves. It nudges up to around $25,000. That's it. A 5-fold increase in wealth, and spending increases by less than double. Now you're probably thinking, okay, but those are just frugal people, self-selected, not representative of what a real retirement actually costs. And yeah, that's a fair instinct. But here's what changes the picture. These aren't people living small. $15,000 a month is $180,000 a year after taxes. That's 2 international trips, a mortgage on a very comfortable home, private gym memberships, good restaurants, and still money left over. $25,000 a month is $300,000 a year. That is an objectively lavish life by any reasonable standard. The point isn't that wealthy people are secretly minimalists. The point is that spending has a ceiling, and that ceiling arrives much earlier than most people assume. There's a term for this in behavioral economics: marginal utility. Each additional dollar you spend returns less satisfaction than the one before it. The first vacation home changes your life. The third one is mostly maintenance. The pattern holds almost universally, across income levels, across cultures, across generations. You reach a point where more money stops producing more life. What this means practically is significant. If spending plateaus, then the portfolio required to sustain that spending also plateaus. You don't need infinite money to fund a finite lifestyle. And that insight, that simple mechanical relationship between what you spend and what you need, is exactly where the math starts to work in your favor, which brings us to the actual calculation. Because once we know what wealthy people genuinely spend, we can work backward to find the portfolio size that funds it. And the number that comes out the other end is going to reframe everything you thought you knew about what it actually takes to get there. Here's something that almost never gets said out loud in retirement planning conversations. The math only gets scary when you start from the wrong end. Most people begin with a big number, 10 million, 15 million, and work forward, trying to figure out how to get there. But if you flip the direction, if you start with what people actually spend and work backward to the portfolio that funds it, the picture changes completely. That's exactly what we're going to do here. We already know the spending data. Wealthy households in the $1 to $10 million net worth range spend around $15,000 a month. That's $180,000 a year after taxes. Now the question is simple. What size portfolio do you need to generate that income reliably without running out of money? And this is where the withdrawal rate comes in. A withdrawal rate is just the percentage of your portfolio you pull out each year to live on. For decades, the standard figure was 4%, meaning if you had $1 million, you could safely withdraw $40,000 a year, and historical market returns would keep the portfolio alive indefinitely. That number has been updated, based on current market conditions and longer life expectancies. Most retirement researchers in 2026 put the sustainable withdrawal rate at around 4.7%. It's a small adjustment, but it matters in the math. So let's run it. $180,000 a year is your spending target, but you're not funding all of it from your portfolio. A retired couple in the United States collecting Social Security at full retirement age is pulling in somewhere between $60,000 and $72,000 a year combined, depending on their earnings history. Let's use $72,000. That's already covered. Your portfolio only needs to generate the remaining $108,000. Divide $108,000 by 4.7%. The portfolio you need is approximately $2.3 million. Let that land for a second. $2.3 million funds a life that looks like this: a paid-off home in a comfortable city, 2 international trips a year, dinner out twice a week, a newer car every 5 or 6 years, and no financial stress. That's the wealthy lifestyle tier, and it costs $2.3 million, not 10. Now let's push it further, because some of you are looking at that and thinking, I want more than comfortable. I want the upper end. Fair enough. Let's use the spending data from the $10 to $50 million net worth group. $25,000 a month, $300,000 a year. This is the genuinely luxurious tier. Multiple properties, business class travel, no price checking on anything that matters. What does it take to fund that? Same math. Subtract Social Security. Your portfolio needs to cover around $228,000 a year. At 4.7%, that requires a portfolio of approximately $4.8 million. Round it to $5 million for a comfortable margin, and you have the ceiling. That is the number that funds a life most people would describe as extravagant. Not 15 million, not 20, 5. And this is the part worth sitting with. Even the most aspirational, top-tier retirement lifestyle, the kind that puts you in the spending range of people worth $50 million, doesn't require anywhere near what the internet suggests. The gap between the fear and the math is that wide. But here's where one important variable changes everything. All of these numbers assume you're retiring at a conventional age, with Social Security already in play. What if you want to leave 10 years earlier? What if the whole point is to stop before the system is ready to support you? That's where the early retirement bridge strategy comes in, and it requires thinking about your money in a fundamentally different way. Most people think early retirement is just regular retirement, but sooner, it isn't. The math is structurally different, and if you try to solve it with the same approach, you'll either overshoot your number by millions or run out of money at 73. The reason comes down to one thing. Social Security doesn't wait for your schedule. Here's the problem in plain terms. The calculations in the previous section assumed a retired couple collecting around $72,000 a year from Social Security. That income was doing a lot of heavy lifting. It covered 40% of the spending target before the portfolio contributed a single dollar. But Social Security has an eligibility floor. Full benefits don't start until 67 for most people retiring today. If you want to leave at 57, that income stream doesn't exist yet. Your portfolio has to carry everything alone for a full decade. That changes the number significantly, but not in the direction most people assume. This is where the early retirement bridge strategy comes in. Instead of treating your savings as one single pool of money, you divide it into two separate buckets with two different jobs. The first bucket is the bridge fund. This is the money you live on from the day you retire until Social Security kicks in, roughly 10 years. Because the bridge fund has a defined endpoint, you don't need to apply a conservative long-term withdrawal rate to it. You can draw it down more aggressively. Think of it like a runway. You know exactly how long it needs to last, so you size it accordingly. For a wealthy lifestyle spending target of $180,000 a year, a 10-year bridge fund needs to hold around $1.8 million. That accounts for inflation and a modest return on whatever portion stays invested during that window. The second bucket is the long-term fund. You don't touch this one, not once during those 10 years. It stays fully invested, compounding quietly in the background, while the bridge fund covers your life at a 7% average annual return. A reasonable long-term assumption based on diversified market performance, $1 million left untouched for 10 years, becomes approximately $1.96 million, nearly double. Time is doing the work you're not doing. By the time the bridge runs dry, two things happen simultaneously. Social Security starts, and your long-term fund has grown substantially. From that point forward, the math looks almost identical to a conventional retirement. The portfolio is larger than it would have been if you'd been drawing from it all along, and the government income fills the same gap it always would have. So what's the total number for this early retirement plan? For the wealthy lifestyle tier, $180,000 a year in spending, you need roughly $1.8 million in the bridge fund and somewhere between $2 and $2.3 million in the long-term fund, combined starting portfolio, around $4 million. For the upper-end lifestyle at $300,000 a year, that total climbs to approximately $5 million, and $5 million to retire a decade early and live at the spending level of someone worth $50 million. That's the actual math. Now, what's interesting is that most people who've done this calculation don't arrive at the number and immediately feel relief. They feel something more complicated, because the number isn't really the hard part. Deciding when enough is actually enough. That's where most people get stuck, which brings us to someone who got very close to that edge, stared at the decision directly, and made a choice that's worth understanding in detail. There's a specific moment that happens to a certain kind of high earner. They hit a number they've been building toward for years, sometimes a decade, and instead of feeling done, they feel a strange pull to keep going. Not because they need more, because stopping feels unfamiliar, because the goalpost has been at the edge of their vision for so long that removing it creates a kind of vertigo. That moment has a name in behavioral finance. It's called the arrival fallacy, and almost nobody who experiences it recognizes it while it's happening. Here's how it played out for someone worth paying attention to. A corporate attorney in Chicago, mid-50s, 30 years in practice, had spent his entire career working toward a single number, $6 million. That was the figure he'd written on a legal pad sometime in his late 20s, and the one he'd never really revised. By early 2024, his net worth had reached $5.6 million, close enough that his financial advisor ran the full retirement projection and came back with a clear answer. You're done. You can stop. He sat with that for a week. Then he came back with a question. If I work another 5 years, he asked, can I afford to fly private regularly? His advisor ran the numbers. To support private aviation as a lifestyle, not a one-off charter, but actual regular use, he'd need a net worth somewhere north of $16 million. At his current savings rate, 5 more years of work would get him to around $7.8 million. Not even close. He'd need to nearly triple what he already had, and he'd have to give up 5 years he couldn't get back to do it. He retired the following month. What's interesting about that story isn't the decision, it's the question he asked. He wasn't asking about private jets because he'd always dreamed of them. He'd flown commercial his entire career without complaint. He was asking because his brain was searching for a justification to keep going. to defer the unfamiliar feeling of being finished. The jet was a proxy for something else entirely. This is what the research on retirement psychology consistently shows. High earners who delay retirement past their financial independence date rarely do so because they've identified a genuine spending need that isn't covered. They do it because work has been the primary structure of their identity for decades, and removing it feels like subtraction rather than freedom. The financial rationale comes after the emotional one. The math gets recruited to support a feeling that already exists. And here's what makes the attorney's case instructive. $5.6 million at a 4.7% withdrawal rate generates approximately $263,000 a year. Add Social Security at full retirement age, and you're looking at a combined income somewhere above $300,000 annually. That is, by any honest measure, an extraordinary life. The gap between what he had and what he needed was essentially zero. The gap between what he had and what he thought he needed was manufactured, built not from data, but from habit and anxiety. He found it enough, but it took an outside voice and a clear spreadsheet to help him see it. The attorney's story isn't unusual. It's actually the rule more than the exception, and it raises a question worth sitting with. If the math can be that clear, and people still struggle to accept it, what's actually driving the feeling that it's never quite enough? That answer lives almost entirely in psychology, and the forces behind it are more deliberate than most people realize. Consider what just happened in that story. A man with $5.6 million, a clear retirement projection, and an advisor telling him directly that he was finished, still needed a reason to stop. The math was solved. The psychology wasn't. And that gap between what the numbers say and what the mind accepts is where most retirement plans quietly fall apart. It's worth understanding why. Because it isn't random, and it isn't a weakness. There are specific mechanisms at work. The first one is the industry itself. The financial services sector in the United States manages roughly $115 trillion in assets as of 2026. That is not a number that benefits from people feeling financially secure. A client who believes they have enough stops contributing. They consolidate. They simplify. They become, from a revenue perspective, significantly less valuable. The incentive structure of the industry, the fees, the products, the advice, runs almost entirely in one direction. More savings, more coverage, more runway, more buffer. The message isn't fabricated out of malice. It's just what the incentives produce. Follow the money, and the anxiety starts to make a lot more sense. The second mechanism is subtler. It's the way net worth becomes a scoreboard. For people who've spent decades in high-performance careers, law, finance, medicine, engineering, professional success has always been measurable. Billable hours, case outcomes, portfolio returns, quarterly numbers. The brain gets trained to optimize for a metric, to find satisfaction in the movement of a number upward. And when that same brain gets pointed at a retirement account, like it does exactly what it was trained to do, it treats the balance like a score. Hitting the target doesn't feel like winning. It just resets the game at a higher level. This is why people who reach their original retirement number so often invent a new one. Not because their life requires it, because the habit of chasing requires it. The goalpost moves not from financial necessity, but from psychological momentum. Now here's the part worth being honest about. Neither of these forces, industry incentives or identity-driven accumulation, announces itself clearly. Nobody sits down and thinks, I'm going to let a fee-based financial product determine my retirement date. Nobody consciously decides to keep working because stopping feels like losing. These things operate below the level of explicit reasoning, and they show up as a vague sense that the number isn't quite right yet, that one more year of savings would just make things more comfortable, that it would be irresponsible to stop now. That feeling is real. The rationale behind it usually isn't. This is why the definition of enough matters so much, and why getting it wrong is so costly. Not in abstract terms, but in years. The 2024 study tracking high-income professionals found that the average gap between reaching financial independence and actually retiring was 4.3 years. 4 years of work that the math didn't require. 4 years of mornings that belonged to someone else's schedule. For a lot of people, that's the difference between retiring healthy and retiring with the first signs of the things that come with staying too long. Enough is not a number on a spreadsheet, and it was never going to be. It's the point at which your money can fully support the life you actually want, not the life the industry told you to want, not the score your career trained you to chase. That realization, when it lands, changes how you read every financial decision that comes after it. And understanding it clearly is exactly what the psychology of enough is designed to help you see. Here's the thing nobody warns you about. Understanding the psychology of enough intellectually is completely different from feeling it. You can read every study, run every projection, sit with a financial advisor who tells you clearly that the math works, and still walk out of that meeting with a low hum of unease that you can't quite locate or explain. That feeling isn't a flaw in your reasoning. It's the output of a system that was specifically designed to produce it. So let's name the mechanisms directly, because naming them is the first step to not being controlled by them. The first trap is what behavioral economists call loss aversion asymmetry. Losses feel roughly twice as painful as equivalent gains feel good, which means that the prospect of running out of money in retirement, even a statistically unlikely scenario, registers as a threat disproportionate to its actual probability. A $2.3 million portfolio with a 4.7% withdrawal rate has survived every major market downturn in the last century, including 2008, including 2020, and including the inflationary period of 2022. The math is not fragile, but the feeling of fragility is persistent because the brain weighs the downside scenario far more heavily than the data justifies. The second trap is social comparison, and in 2026, this one is harder to escape than it has ever been. Financial content online is almost entirely optimized around aspiration and anxiety. The people posting their net worth updates, their portfolio milestones, their FIRE numbers, they are not a representative sample of the population. They are a self-selected group of high accumulators, and the algorithm serves them to you repeatedly because engagement follows emotion. Comparing your retirement number to what circulates in those spaces is like measuring your physical fitness against professional athletes. The reference point is designed to make you feel behind. The third trap is the one the attorney's story illustrated directly: identity capture. When your sense of self has been built around professional achievement for 30 years, retirement doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like subtraction. And the mind, trying to protect the self, manufactures financial justifications for staying. One more year becomes a pattern. The goalpost moves, the number grows, and the life you are building toward keeps receding. Here's what cuts through all three: specificity, not a vague aspiration toward security, but a concrete, detailed picture of the life you're actually trying to fund. What does a Tuesday look like? Where are you living? What are you doing at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday in February? What does your most expensive month of the year actually cost, line by line? When you build that picture and price it honestly, two things happen. The number becomes real instead of theoretical, and the gap between what you have and what you need becomes measurable instead of infinite. This is the exercise that consistently moves people from chronic financial anxiety to genuine clarity. Not a bigger portfolio, not one more year of saving, a clear and specific accounting of what the life they want actually costs, and the quiet recognition that they are probably closer to it than they have allowed themselves to believe. The goal of everything in this video was never to tell you that money doesn't matter or that saving is optional. It's to show you that the target most people are chasing was never derived from their actual lives. It was absorbed from a culture with strong financial incentives to keep you feeling behind. Your number exists. It's calculable. And for most people doing the math honestly, it arrives much sooner than expected, which raises the question that naturally follows. Once you know your number, how do you actually build toward it in a way that works? And what are the specific mistakes that quietly set that timeline back by years without you ever noticing? Here's what this video is really about: not a number, a mechanism. The reason so many people feel financially behind isn't because they've done the math wrong. It's because they absorbed a target from a system that benefits from them, never feeling finished. The data tells a different story. Spending plateaus. Portfolios have floors. A genuinely comfortable, even luxurious retirement is fundable, at numbers most people are closer to than they realize. The early retirement bridge works. The math is not the enemy. A few things are worth carrying forward. Spending has a ceiling, and it arrives earlier than the industry suggests. The withdrawal rate is the hinge that connects your lifestyle to your portfolio. Social Security is a structural asset, not a bonus. And enough is a psychological state, not a financial one. You don't feel it because you hit a number. You feel it because you decided what the number was for. Take some time this week to price your actual life, not the life you think you should want, the one you do, line by line, month by month. The number that comes back will probably surprise you. And once you have it, the next question becomes, what's quietly working against you reaching it? And how do you fix that without seeing it coming?